Good evening, everyone. Hope that you're doing well. Take just a moment or two to let everybody get in, and then we will begin our conversation together. Okay, good evening. Nice to see all of you. It's been a very, very challenging and difficult week, of course, so we want to take a moment and offer our prayers for all of our family in Israel and all of the children of the Middle East who are taxed by such terrible conditions, and hope that somehow we get blessings of peace out of all of this. Let's just hope for the very, very best. Tonight is our last session of this series on the questions that won't go away. And I certainly want to thank everybody for joining me during these conversations. I'm sorry that they've been such monologues instead of being able to have real conversations, which is what real philosophy is supposed to be. But that's one of the limitations of Zoom, is that it makes it almost impossible to have conversations. So I appreciate your forbearance and patience as we sort of push through this. And hopefully the next time we get to learn together, which will be next fall, we'll get to actually do this in person and see each other and give each other hugs or at least handshakes. So I certainly look forward to that. We've been talking together about the questions that won't go away, the great questions of religious life. And I want to conclude tonight with a sort of summary statement that encompasses the questions we've already dealt with, and to try to answer a sort of very deep and personal question about personal meaning. So I'm sure that you can gather from what I've said so far, that to me, religion doesn't begin with the question, is there a God, and who is God, and where is God, and how do we know that God is real? Religion begins with each of us. And the question that every human being has to ask themselves, who am I? And what life am I leading? And how do I find a sense of purpose in my life? Where do I gain the resilience in my life to deal with the challenges, the tragedies that accompany every human life? How do I understand my own self? I said at the very beginning that I define religion as a sort of map of the universe, that you come into the mall looking for a particular shop, and instead of wandering the mall aimlessly for hours on end, you find that stanchion, that station, that display, which has a giant map of the mall. And it tells you how to find the particular shop you're looking for, because it gives you the layout of the entire mall. And it has that all-important orange spot that says, you are here. And religion does very much the same. Religion tells us what we can expect of life and where to find the things that are valuable in life, how to find them in all of the buzzing experience of our existence, and where we are in this layout of a universe. So the great question is, how do I find a sense of satisfaction? How do I find a sense of authenticity? How do I find a sense of purpose in the existence that I am given to live? And once I begin asking that question and truly exploring that and coming to understand that, then a secondary question, a corollary question is, what universe would I have to live in order to make sense of my own existence? How would I have to understand the larger universe in order to understand what it is that I find purposeful in my existence? I think I gave you the example in our very first session that I have an argument with a kid who's having his bar mitzvah, and he tells me he doesn't believe in God. So the question I ask him, of course, is, um, tell me what you mean by God, and let's find out if we can believe in something similar. But then what I'll ask him is, do you give charity? And the kid says, of course I give charity. I said, well, what do you give charity to? And the kid will say, I give a few dollars to the American Cancer Society. And I'll say, why? He said, because my grandfather had cancer. My grandmother was lost to cancer. I say, that's wonderful. That's very admirable. And how do you know that the dollar you give goes to cancer research? How do you know it's not just, stolen and squandered somewhere? He says, well, it's the American Cancer Society. It's a bona fide charity. I say, good. That's actually good. You did some research. And let me ask you a harder question. How do you know that the dollar you give, which after all is a dollar you're taking away from your own sort of pleasures and satisfactions? You could be spending that dollar at Starbucks on a coffee, or spending that dollar on a video game that you might enjoy, but you're taking that dollar and giving it to a cause. How do you know that it really has a chance to alleviate suffering in the world? How do you know that the universe isn't so constructed that there's always a sort of a steady state, a sort of standard amount of suffering, and that if you cure one disease, some other disease is going to pop up in its place? How do you know that the universe is amenable to your efforts to make it better? And the kid will look at me a long time. It's like, well, I don't know. I say, you don't. It's a matter of faith. And the reason it's a matter of faith is because if you and I didn't believe that, then we wouldn't be able to gain a sense of our own purpose and meaning in life. And we wouldn't see that the universe can be healed. And that would yield a very, very different kind of life than the life that we live. In order to live the life that I want to live, I have to believe that the universe is so constructed that we can heal its brokenness. In fact, I like the language of brokenness. I like that image, because when something is broken, it means it was once whole and got shattered, but the pieces that are all there to be put back together again. That's a different universe than I might imagine, for example, if I said the universe is dead set against human happiness, sort of a cynical view of that. Or if I said that the universe can't be made whole. Well, this is where we get these ideas of faith. I suggest that we begin with the question, what makes my life meaningful? I suggest that we begin with the question, what makes my life purposeful? I suggest we begin with the question, is there happiness to be had in this existence? And then to build a faith on the basis of that. I think that's the way that one builds a religious life. And that's the sort of search that we go through. And at the same time, I don't close my eyes to the terrible tragedies that occur. Listen, I'm a rabbi. I spend all day long dealing with this stuff. But I'm always impressed at the resilience that people show. I'm always impressed at the way that we can face the tragedies, face the catastrophes, face the darkness, and not succumb to it, not give in, not lose hope, not lose joy, not lose a connection to a life that matters in the face of the catastrophes that come our way. And I think that's a very important human ability, and I want to strengthen that. I want to give that some robust power, because I think that's something, that resilience is something that all of us need. And this year in particular, it's been so very difficult. So the question I want to ask today isn't going to be a question about God. It's actually a question about us. What makes human life meaningful? What makes human life enjoyable? What makes human life successful? What should we give our children and our grandchildren as a legacy, as a way of living life? This is a question that's asked actually all over the Bible, in particular in the book of Kohelet, the book of Ecclesiastes, who asks this question quite in earnest and does a series of experiments to try to figure out, well, what would make my life worthwhile? It's a question that's asked in a more implicit way elsewhere in the Torah. I think in a certain way, it's never asked in a sort of explicit way, because I think this is what the whole of Torah is really all about. And there's a very wonderful story of a stranger who comes to the two teachers of the first century, Hillel and Shammai, and says, teach me the whole Torah while I stand on one foot. And Hillel says, get the hell out of here. And Shammai says, that which is hateful to you, don't do to your neighbor. Everything else is commentary. Go learn it. I would answer a little bit differently, although I deeply, deeply appreciate Hillel's kindness and his moral principle. I think the real question is, if you want to learn Torah on one foot, begin with the question that God begins with in the early chapters of Genesis. Ayeka, where are you? And where are you going? And who goes with you? And what are you trying to accomplish in the years you live in this world? What would give you a sense of satisfaction? These are the questions that I think are the most important questions to ask. And these, I think, are the questions that the Jewish tradition comes to answer in a very powerful and very imaginative way. I really think that's what the tradition is here to teach us. And I'm going to try to show that tonight through a series of texts that I find very, very important to me. And they're texts that I've taught many times before. So if you've heard them from me, I apologize, but all of life is reruns. So let's take a look together. When I read the Torah, I read the Torah as at least the beginning chapters of Genesis, as a drama in 3 acts. When we first open the Torah, Breshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, in the beginning God created the heaven and earth, we're introduced to a character named God. We know nothing about this God. We don't know where God came from. We don't know what he's made out of. We don't know what he derives his power from. We don't know where he lives. We know nothing about this character except 2 things. He creates and he dreams. And he creates a world. And into that world, he drops one creature whom he invests with the power to be his partner in enjoying that world and taking care of it. That partner, of course, is the human being. And he puts that partner into the world. There's 2 different stories of this. In the first, man is created in the image of God. In the second, man is created of the breath of God. And he puts that creature into the world. But because God is a creator, he creates man to be a creator. And man wants to create the greatest of all creations. He wants to create himself. He resents being put into a position where he's told what he can do and what he can't do. He wants knowledge. He wants authority. He wants the power to create himself. And man then disappoints God. And at the end of this chapter, man so turns inward and wants to aggrandize himself that he fills the world with violence. He fills the world with such violence. And at the end of the first act of our drama, God gives up on this creature. He wanted to create a partner. He wanted to create someone who would enjoy the world. He wanted to create someone who would share the work of creation. But man so disappoints God that God is ready to chuck it all. And just before he does, his eye catches one human being who has potential. His name is Noah. And instead of chucking it all, he decides to wipe the world clean and give Noah a new start. Noah is the new, as it were, Adam. I couldn't create a human being to be my partner. Maybe I can choose this one. And he invests Noah with the same covenant that he invested Adam. But Noah also disappoints him. And once again, the world becomes corrupt. Now God despairs. I couldn't create a human being to be my partner. I couldn't choose one to be my partner. But maybe instead I can teach one. And he chooses one human being. And that human being's name is Abram. Now, there's a long midrashic tradition about why Abraham was the one that God chose. But I can tell you the reason. It's clear. His name began with an A. He was the first one in line. It was a random choice because that's what makes sense in the story. God chooses this human being and God says to him, I'm going to teach you to be my partner. And he enters the life of this human being and makes a deal. And it's in Genesis chapter 12. The Lord said to Abram, Lech lecha me'artzecha, go forth from your native land, from your father's house, from the place of your birth, to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you, and curse those who curse you, and all the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you. Now, what's extraordinary about this, I couldn't create a man to be my partner. I couldn't choose one. Rather than look for someone whose character is that way, maybe God can teach someone. And that's what this effort becomes. Maybe one human being can represent divine blessing, can be a vessel of divine blessing in the world. And that becomes Abram. And what's so amazing about this story, and this is going to surprise you, is that every culture has pretty much the same story. If you've ever read Joseph Campbell, you know this, right? Every ancient Near mythology, ancient Near Eastern mythologies, Greek and Roman mythologies, Polynesian mythologies, Australian Aboriginal mythologies, Navajo mythologies, they all have the same story. The God enters the life of a hero and says, be my guy, and I will bless you and I will make you great. All of the elements of the story are common. And the Bible knows you've read Joseph Campbell. The Bible knows that you're going to recognize this story and say, I know what's coming. I know what's coming, right? I will make of you a great nation. Yeah, all the gods say that. And I will bless you. All the gods say that. And I will make your name great. All the gods say that. But the next line in all the other mythologies is, and together we will conquer and rule the world. That's what it's supposed to say next. But the Bible is the aberration. The Bible is the exception. In the Bible, God doesn't say we will conquer the world. In the Bible, it doesn't say we will rule the world. In the Bible, man is given a responsibility. This man, this Abram, is given a responsibility. What's his responsibility? Heye bracha. Be a blessing. Be a blessing. Now, I know what it means to say a blessing. What does it mean to be a blessing? And to whom is he to be a blessing? Well, let's just use the colloquial for a minute. Is there anybody in the world that you would say is your blessing? Is there anyone in the world who's been there at the moment you needed a friend, you needed someone to support and love you? Is there anyone who's contributed to your existence that when someone mentions that person's name, you'd say, my blessing? Well, that's what God tells Abraham to be. You're to be a blessing to the world. Now, what's remarkable about that, number one, is he's to be a blessing, not to conquer, not to rule, but to be a blessing. But if God needs him to be a blessing, that means God is not omnipotent. God needs a partner. God needs someone to be the vessel of blessing in the world. God can't do it himself. Now, the question is, who's going to be the object of this? I'll bless those who bless you. I like that. And curse those who curse you. I like that even more because I drive freeways in LA. I want to put that on a bumper sticker. And all the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you. All the families of the earth shall be blessed in you. You are to be a source of blessing for all the families in the world. So here's a question. Here's our first quiz question. Is this the ultimate statement of Jewish particularity, the specialness of being a Jew? Or is this the ultimate statement of Jewish universalism, our concern and our commitment to the rest of humankind? And the answer is yes, because you can't separate them. Because that's what Genesis is trying to tell you. That if you try to say, I'm a Jew and I couldn't care less about the world, you're not a Jew. And if you say, I care about the world, but I don't care for my own people, you're not a Jew. That here you have both. In order to care about the world, you've got to start individually. All of us start in our own family. All of us start with our own circle. In order to be a universalist, you've got to be a good particularist. But you can't be a particularist only for the sake of particularism. You're a particularist so that it strengthens your ability to be a universalist. Does that make sense? That's what Jewish means. That's what Jewish means. And the struggle between the emphasis on particularism, my people and their needs, and Jewish universalism, my concern for the world and their needs, is a constant struggle. And anytime you let go of either end of the struggle, you've let go of what it means to be truly Jewish. Be a blessing. Incidentally, this to me is the greatest bar mitzvah speech ever written. I have sat through a number of bar mitzvahs in my life, as you can imagine. And I've listened to parents speak to kids, and I've listened to kids make speeches. And I've heard lots and lots of things that we tell our kids, but this is the only one that matters. Kid, I hope you go to Stanford or Yale or Oberlin or UCLA or Berkeley or Michigan or Moore Park or Pierce College. Anywhere you go, I hope you get to go to college, and I hope you find material success. I really do. Right? I had a little guy once get up for his bar mitzvah. I swear this is the truth. And the kid said, the rabbi told me not to tell you this, but I'm going to tell it to you anyway. Now that I'm an adult, now that I'm a man of the Jewish tradition, here are my wishes. I want to date a supermodel. I want to have a condo in Maui, and I want to drive a Ferrari. And then he looked over me with this big sort of smile, like, I got you, Rabbi. I did what you told me not to do. And I'm sitting there asking myself, what should I do for this fellow? Maybe I should revoke his bris, you know? So I got up to give him his blessing, and he was terrified at this point because he realized that I'm going to get the last word. And I put my arm around this little 13-year-old twit, and I said, you know, my boy, I hope you get everything you want. I hope you introduce me one day to the supermodel who's your girlfriend. And I hope you invite me one day to visit your Maui condo. And I hope one day you give me a ride in your Ferrari. But you know what? You're going to make a discovery. You're going to discover that those things are lovely, but that's not going to make you happy. It's not going to be ultimately what you discover you most want. Or rather, these are the things you want, but that's not what you most need. What every one of us needs even more than the supermodel and the Ferrari and the Maui condo is an abiding sense of purpose, why I'm in the world and what I need to be doing with all of my energies and resources in the world. And for that, here's the answer. Be a blessing. Let's tell our kids to be blessings. That's what we want them to be. Right? It's wonderful if they get into good universities. I'm so proud of them. It's wonderful if they make a wonderful material living. I'm proud of them for that too. It's wonderful, but that's not going to give them what they most need in life. What they most need in life is a mission, a sense of purpose, a narrative that unites all of the experience of their lives into a project. And what's the great project of the Jewish people? To be a blessing. To be a blessing. That's what we're here in the world to do. That's why we're in the world. Now, this text, I think, sort of launches this concern for what we're to do. But there's another piece of it that I want to go take a look at next. A few chapters later, three angels show up in Abraham's tent. The first angel tells him and his wife that they're going to be parents, which is kind of amazing, you know, because she's 90 and he's 100, and Viagra won't be invented for quite a while. You know, so mazel tov, you're going to be parents. The other two angels stay with Abraham, and we have this story. It's a very famous story. The men set out from there to look down towards Sodom. Abraham lives in Hebron, on the edge of Hebron and Kiryat Arba, and just down in the Rift Valley was where Sodom is. Now the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm going to do? And the answer is, of course you should. You're God. You don't have to tell Abraham. You don't tell anybody what you're going to do. What fun is it to be God if you got to give explanations? But that's the point of the story, you see. Once God admits a partner to bring blessing to the world, God has to explain what he's about to do. And he says, I've singled him out to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is just and right. Therefore, he has to understand me. And God now realizes that there's a limitation that's placed on one. If you engage a partner, the partner has to be brought in to the decisions. The partner has to be brought into the project. And the project is to pursue justice in the world. So now God says the outrage of Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, I'll go take a look. The men went on from there to Sodom, Abraham remaining standing before the Lord. And here's the speech, verse 23 in chapter 18. Abraham came forward. Vayigash Avraham. He stepped into the fray. And here's his soliloquy. It's one of the great soliloquies of the Bible. He says to God, will you sweep away the innocent along with the guilty? What if there be 50 innocent in the city? Will you wipe out the place and not forgive it for the sake of the 50 innocent? Far be it from you, the Hebrew is chalila lecha, to do such a thing, to bring death upon innocent as guilty. so that innocent and guilty fare alike, far be it from you, shall not the judge of all the earth do justice? And God answers, if I find 50 innocent ones, I'll forgive the place for their sake. Now, it's a remarkable speech. This man stands in front of God, as it were, and he says to him, you want to destroy Sodom? God says, yeah. He says, you can't. I said, why not? Because there might be 50 innocent in a city. You can't do that. And this line here is particular. Far be it from you. The Hebrew isn't far be it from you. That's H.L. Ginsberg, the great translator. He went to the University of London and had a beautiful command of English. But the Hebrew is much more earthy. It's Chalila lecha. Anybody here have a Yiddish, speak Yiddish, or have a Yiddish speaking parents or grandparents? Chalila lecha is best translated as shanda and a cherpa, right? Chalila lecha means shame on you. It's what my bubby used to yell at me when I would beat up my little brother. My bubby she never touched me. She never hurt me, but she would see me beating up my brother. She would shake her head and she would simply say, oh, shanda and a cherpa. You know, which is gets you to the core, because it meant I'm so disappointed in you. This is what Abraham says to God. I'm so disappointed in you to do such a thing, to bring death upon the innocent as well as the guilty. And then the next phrase is even earthier than this. In Hebrew, it's v'haya katzadi karasha. So that innocent and guilty are the same. So that there's no moral differentiation in the world. Is that the world you wanted, God? He says. Is that the world you aspire to? A world where there's no moral differentiation? A world where right and wrong, good and evil, innocent and guilt have no difference, no distance in between them? Is that the world you wanted? Chalila lecha. He repeats it again. Shame on you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do justly? Now, what's amazing is the very next line, because, you tell God you can't do this, you would imagine God doesn't react well. But in the next line, what happens? God says, okay, all right, fine, you win. Why? Why does God react that way? Why doesn't God get angry and smash this man like a bug? Why doesn't God get angry and push him back? Why doesn't God get angry at all? Why does God give in? And in case you miss it, the Bible then now goes on and gives you an absurd scenario. Once God says, okay, Abraham knows what to do next, because he sold enough camels in the shuk of Beersheba. He knows when you have a live one in a shop. He says, you said 50, right? You said 50. 50, you'd spare the city for 50. What if it's missing 5? When you give me 45, I get 45. Okay, 5 more. Do I get 40? Can I hear 40? Okay, you got 40. Can I hear 30? Would you say 30? 30, I got 30. Okay, can I hear 20? 20, good. 20, can I see 10? Is there anywhere in the room someone will give me 10? 10 going once, 10 going twice, 10 sold to the God of the universe. It's an absurd story. Why is it here? Because the Bible is trying to make a point. It's trying to make a point. Abraham was chosen in order to advance God's vision of justice in the world, to be a vessel of blessing in the world, to show the world an example of righteousness. God is willing to compromise God's prerogative and God's authority, even God's image, in order to pursue that blessing of justice in the world. And if Abraham is arguing on the basis of that justice, then he has a right to stand in front of God himself and say, you can't do this. And the story is that absurd because it wants to drive home that point, that God will allow a human being to stand there and to argue with him if it's in the name of justice. He's not arguing for his own interest. He's not arguing for his family. He's not arguing for anything that's selfish. He's arguing for what God prizes most. He's arguing for justice. And as long as he's arguing for justice, that is rewarded with God's acquiescence. It's what the Talmud beautifully calls Chutzpah klapei shamaya. Chutzpah in front of God. Now, chutzpah is an interesting word. We all know chutzpah is Yiddish, right? And chutzpah means what? Nerve, temerity, cheek. Sometimes it even means insolence, right? The clinical definition of chutzpah is the kid who kills his parents and then throws himself on the mercy of the court as an orphan, which was funny until somebody actually did it, you know? But really, there is another definition of chutzpah that's much older than that Yiddish one. We find the word chutzpah already in the Talmud. Chutzpah in the Talmud means something else. Chutzpah in the Talmud means irrepressible life, irrepressible strength, irrepressible courage. There's a beautiful saying in the Talmud Yerushalmi, in the Jerusalem Talmud, that says the land of Israel is possessed of a quality of chutzpah because no matter how many times it's conquered, every year it flowers with beautiful wildflowers. Irrepressible life. And here you have that in Abraham, irrepressible courage. The courage of knowing who he is and where he fits in God's world. And because that's who he is, and because that's where he fits in God's world, well, then he knows exactly what he can get away with. It is his responsibility to stand in front of power and speak the truth. It is his responsibility to point out to God himself that justice has to be done. It's his responsibility to appeal for the sanctity of human life under all circumstances. That's his responsibility. And Abraham is our forefather. And Abraham is the embodiment of all of us. And that's our responsibility. That's what it means, Hayei bracha, to be a blessing in the world. That's what's expected of us. Now, let's go one more step. You ready? So much for Abraham. He's an extraordinary soul. What if you're God and you want to train a whole people to walk the world with that same sensibility? How do you do it? Well, you bring them to a classroom, and the classroom is called Egypt. Why were we slaves in the land of Egypt? Why would God let his chosen people be enslaved for 270 years? Why would God do that to us? Because God wanted us to learn a lesson. And the lessons have to do with how you are a blessing in the world. Let's take a look at that as well, shall we? A little farther into the text, okay? I'm going to skip a little bit of this and keep going down. A little farther into the text. Take a look at the Bible in the book of Exodus, the book of Deuteronomy, and find me all of the places where we are told to do something because you were a slave in the land of Egypt. And then you'll understand what Egypt was in the mind of the Bible. Egypt was the classroom. It was a classroom where an entire people would be infused with this ideal of being a blessing, of championing a certain quality of justice in the world. In the chapters just after the 10 Commandments are given, this mitzvah appears. You will not wrong a stranger or oppress him. You were strangers in the land of Egypt. You'll not ill-treat any widow or orphan. Stranger, widow, orphan. They live among us, but they have no power. They have no redress. They can be taken advantage of, and you can get away with it. You can get away with it, because then what are they going to do? The stranger has no standing in a court of law. The widow has no husband to protect her, and the orphan has no father to protect him. What are they going to do if you try to take advantage of them? Torah says you don't do that. Now, why not do it? Why not do it? Well, we could have offered a Platonic ethic from Plato and said, I don't want you to do this because it's the wrong thing to do. And that's true, by the way. It is the wrong thing to do. For Plato, ethics are cognitive. If you know the good, you'll do the good. But the Bible understands people are more complicated than that. We know the good and we don't always do the good. If that were the case, then, Coca-Cola wouldn't be selling as well as it does. Sometimes we know the good and don't do the good. Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher, said, doing the good is your duty, but sometimes we don't obey our duty. The Torah roots this ethic. It's the same ethical conclusion, but it roots it in a different process. It's rooted in your memory of being a slave in the land of Egypt. Because you were a slave in the land of Egypt, you do not oppress a stranger, a widow, or an orphan. Why? Because you were him. You were her. You can't see these people without feeling, that's me. That's who I was. That's who I am. There's some part of me which is still that. And that changes the way that we Jews walk the world. We can't help but seeing them as our problem, as a need of ourselves, because we are commanded to be a blessing. The element, the content of that is to see the world through the eyes of that experience and see the vulnerable and see the powerless and see the needy and see the poor as our issue, as our problem, as something we can't ignore. Let's go a little farther. Let's take a look at one more mitzvah here. This one you all recognize. This is in the second repetition of the repetition of the Ten Commandments in the book of Deuteronomy. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Well, that's good. As the Lord commanded you. 6 days you will labor and do all your work. The seventh day is Sabbath. You'll not do any work. You, your son or daughter, your male or female servant, your ox or your beast or any of your cattle, even the stranger in your settlement, so that your male or female servant or slave may rest as you do. Remember, you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and God freed you from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath. Now, there's a very powerful, subtle message here. 6 days, you're the boss. 6 days, you are the householder, and the servant works for you, or the slave works for you. 6 days, the animals work for you. 6 days, you can say to the servant, go out and plow the field. 6 days, you can say to the servant, fix me a sandwich. 6 days, you can say, clean the house. 6 days, you can say, fix the meal. But on Shabbos, what happens? You rest, but who else rests? Everybody rests. The servant, the slave, the animals rest. Everybody rests, which means that on the seventh day, if you say to your servant, fix me a sandwich, the servant is going to say, fix your own damn sandwich. 6 days, you can tell him who he is. But on the seventh day, he's no longer your servant. He becomes your equal. The animals we live with no longer are there to serve us. On the seventh day, they become citizens of the world like us. Sounds a little bit like the Garden of Eden, where everybody was equal and no one ruled over anyone. So 6 days a week, we have a social hierarchy where the boss is on top, the master is on top, and servants and employees and slaves are at the bottom, and animals below that. But on the seventh day, the social hierarchy collapses. Everyone becomes everyone else's equal. So that you always remember that this person is working for you as an employee. This person may even be an indentured servant, which is what the Bible calls slaves. But that's not built into the universe. That's not metaphysical. That's not his station in life forever. That's just the contemporary arrangement of the social hierarchy. And the social hierarchy is something that we invented. God didn't invent it. I think I told this story a couple of times when I was doing Friday night services because it always sticks with me. I lived in the dormitories of the Hebrew University for a year when I was a student, and then I lived again at Neve Shechter when I was a graduate student. There was a guy in the university I lived at the end of the hallway, and next to my room were the bathrooms. So there was a guy there who cleaned the bathroom. He was a Mizrahi guy, Morocco, I think Iraqi is what he was. And he'd come in a couple times a week with his bucket and mop, and he'd clean the bathroom. That was his job. He was the janitor for the dormitories at the Hebrew University. And I used to go in there in the morning and shave and shower, and I'd meet him and I'd talk to him. I'd kibitz with him. I wanted to learn Hebrew, and his Hebrew was exquisite, and he was a sweet man, and got to know him. And so one week he says to me, what do you do for Shabbat? And I say, I'm here with the other students. We make Shabbat. He says, well, come by me. And I said, that would be an honor. That would be lovely. He said, good. And he gave me his address. And he said, better yet, come to the synagogue where I pray, and then we'll walk home from the synagogue. He told me where the synagogue was. So that Friday night, I got him a bottle of wine. I got a cake. I mean, I did all the things that you do if you're going to someone's house for Shabbos, and I put on my white shirt and my slacks. That's how you wear what you wear at Shabbat at Jerusalem. And I met him in the synagogue. And it was the most wonderful thing. The synagogue was a tiny little hovel. It actually was meeting in a bomb shelter under an apartment building. Because it was a bomb shelter, the acoustics were exquisite. And I looked around the room and I see all of these men. It was all men in their white shirts and their beautiful, beautiful starch pants. And they all looked so regal. And I recognized my friend. And I recognized all the other guys who were the janitors and the cafeteria workers and basically the lower working class, the proletariat that serviced the university and took care of upper crust kids like me. But this night, on Friday night, they sat there like princes. And then I went back to his house and realized he wasn't a prince, he was a king. Because as soon as he got to the house, his children are there, his grandchildren, and they look at him with such reverence. His wife and his daughters-in-law had prepared a meal. It was a very patriarchal society. But the way this man sat at the Shabbos table and ruled over his kingdom, it really was what the Bible had in mind. 6 days a week, he cleaned the toilets in Beit Sprinzak in the dormitories of the Hebrew University. But on Shabbat, he was regal. He was a king. And that's what the Torah has in mind, so that nobody internalizes their position in a social hierarchy, that everyone is given a chance to have the dignity of being a human being. That's what the Torah has in mind. And this is how, again, this is how you operationalize, this is how you make real this idea of Heye Bracha, you will be a blessing. You will be a blessing. Here's one more. You'll not subvert the rights of the stranger, the fatherless. You'll not take a widow's garment and pawn. Now that's a little detail you could read over too quickly. You'll not take a widow's garment and pawn. Think about that for a second. There's a story there. There's a movie there. She was a royal lady. She had beautiful things. She lived in a beautiful home. She had beautiful dresses and beautiful jewels and art on the wall, and her kids went to expensive private schools, and she drove a fancy car, and he made a fortune, and they went out together into the world, and everyone recognized it, the housewives of Beverly Hills kind of thing, right? And then what happened? He died. Left her as a widow, and left her with what? A tax liability, a health care bill, a criminal judgment. It all went to hell. And in order to meet her obligation, she had to sell the jewels and the dresses. And in order to meet the obligation, she had to sell the artwork and give away the house and go to a smaller house and the fancy cars and get something simple. And then when she lost it all, but still had children to feed, what's the last thing she sells? Don't take a widow's garment and pawn. The shirt off her back, she sells her own dignity. She sells herself. Because better to do that than to see her children starve. And what does Torah say? Don't let that happen. Don't allow anyone to fall to that level of indignity. You were a slave in the land of Egypt, and you remember what that was like. You were a slave in Egypt. Don't let anyone taste that bitterness ever in your society. Build a society in such a way that nobody falls to that level, because your society reflects your commitment to be a blessing in the world. And then it gives you a hint of how to do it. When you have a field, when you have a vineyard, when you have an orchard, you don't go over it more than once. You leave the gleanings for the poor, the fatherless, the stranger, and the widow. And that means you recognize that you really don't own any of this stuff. You really just borrow it from God and enjoy the blessings of the land. That's what it means to truly take seriously this idea that you were a blessing in the land you were a blessing in the world. And you learn that through the classroom, through the curriculum of slavery in the land of Egypt. That's what it means to be a blessing. What all of this comes to is a profound understanding that we are empowered. We are empowered by God to bring blessing into the world. We are given the tools to know how to do that. The tools including our own moral imagination, our own powers of conscience, and the laws of Torah, and laws of Torah as a way of envisioning what that might look like. and that we carry this responsibility, and that the dignity that we carry as Jews is that very responsibility. That through that responsibility, each of us in our own special way, being a blessing to the world. That's what we mean when we say that we have a meaning in life, that we have a purpose in life. And that's how you understand yourself in the world. So let's take one more statement here. There's a whole bunch of these. They're all quite remarkable, but I want to do at the very end. So these two statements, they come from the Hasidic tradition. First, Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Leib, the Gerer Rebbe, 19th century, late 19th, early 20th century Polish rabbi. It is within human power to renew everything. The renewal is there within it, since God renews everything every day. Nothing exists without the divine life force, but there's an outer shell. And we have to find the inner power of renewal within everything that we encounter in the world. That's the power that we've been given by God. And Abraham Heschel. Abraham Heschel's wonderful things. He's talking about what it means to be a Jew. To be a Jew is to be sensitive to God's infinite stake in every finite situation, to bear witness to God's presence in the hours of God's concealment, and to remember that the world is unredeemed. We are born to be an answer to God's question. God's question was, Ayeka, where are you? And life is an answer to that question. What are you doing with your life? And we're either on pilgrimage to the holiest place, or we're running away from that question. To remain free and from infatuation with worldly triumphs, to never surrender to splendor. What a great line. We have learned that from Jewish history that if a person is not more than human, they're less than human. Judaism is an attempt to prove that in order to be a human being, you have to be more than human. In order to be a people, you have to be more than a people. We have to reach higher and reach beyond the limits of our own capacity. And in that reaching for the transcendent, that's where we find a sense of meaning. So the answer to the question is, what is the meaning of life? The answer to the question that our faith gives is, the meaning of life is to become a blessing, is to walk the world and find all of the ways in which each of us is empowered and each of us is possible to be a blessing to the world. And the great promise of this, the beautiful promise of this, is that if you do that, if you spend your life doing that, even if you don't succeed, even if it's not, because it's not going to be successful, because it's a divine task. It's not going to be something you're ever going to finish. But having spent a life in that quest, then on your last day in the world, when you're lying on your bed and your great, 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 great grandchildren come around you and they ask you, Nu Bubba, Nu Zayda, was it worth it? Was it worth it? You'll be able to say, yes, it was worth it. You see, in the end, being Jewish is not going to make you thin. Trust me on this. And being Jewish is not going to make you rich. And being Jewish is not going to make you popular. And being Jewish is not going to make you smarter. And I'm not even sure you can say that it's going to make you happy, because I don't think it's designed to do any of that. What it's designed to do is to give you a life that matters, to give you a life of significance, to give you a life that has purpose, to give you a life where you said, I struggled for something worthwhile. And if practiced carefully, it does that exceedingly well. So thank you all for listening. I'll tell you what we'll do. We have a few more minutes before it's time to go to bed. So let's take a few minutes. And if anyone has a question, a comment, or a counter sermon, I'd be glad to try to answer. For those of you who are running off to see what's on TV tonight or have other things to do, I certainly appreciate your being with me tonight. We are going to continue Torah study on Shabbos morning, so you're welcome to join us that. And we'll be continuing the College of Jewish Studies sometime at the end of the summer. So if I don't see you until then, I wish you a very, very pleasant summertime. But if anybody has a question or a comment or a counter sermon about today's session or any of the sessions that we've learned together, I'm delighted to try to make an answer to find an answer for you. Any questions, comments, or counter sermons? When does a rabbi ever offer people that opportunity? Well, yeah, Stan, hi.
Yeah, first I'd have to say that thank you for not only this great session, but all the ones that you've done and all the other things that you do. Uh, the trick to me, and I believe all that you said, is at that same life to balance uh, the joy that I get out of many things in life and the passion and everything that I have for Judaism and Israel and all that goes with it.
Yeah, I see. I think that that's a wonderful thing to say, and I so appreciate it. I think that many of us find a great deal of satisfaction and joy and happiness and friendship and connection in Jewish community life and in Jewish people. Today, frankly, this week, being a member of the Jewish people is harder than ever because you're listening to the horrors from Israel. If rockets landing all over Israel, and sometimes it's very hard. But I think there is a great deal of joy. I mean, I certainly derive a great deal of joy. Um, you know, what other people would make horseradish into a delicacy? My God, you know. Um, but there's a great deal, and if nothing else, we
And
Jews
grate
have.
it yourself.
Yes, that's true. Right,
My
right.
mother grated it herself. She didn't just buy it in the bottle.
So it's because you come
And
from good
cried and
people.
cried and
You,
cried.
you come from good people, Mrs. Wexford. You come from good people,
Yekas
right?
and
Yeah,
yekas.
because yeah, Oliver,
Additional yekas.
amen. Yeah, look, I think that there's a great deal of community and friendship and support in that, and I certainly appreciate that very much. Um, but I ultimately I don't think that's what it's all. I think that's also instrumental. I think that's also there to give us strength and support to do what needs to be done in the world. I mean, nobody believed stronger in Jewish community than my teacher Harold Schulweis, but there was no one who no was no one who represented a stronger sense of personal moral purpose than Rabbi Schulweis. And that really is where I have learned this ethic from. So I think I think it's very nice. And the other thing, Stanley, just to put it in perspective, is we also over the years, having been beaten down so many times, have developed an exquisite sense of humor. And I think that's also an important part of Jewish, is this sense of humor. And sometimes I know I take it too far because I have this irreverent sensibility, but I think that's ultimately very Jewish. I really do. I think that's part of us since the very beginning. And I think that's also one of our coping strategies as Jewish people. Any other questions, anyone? Dick, is that Marcia? Is that you? Hi. You have to speak up so I can hear you. For some reason, I can't hear you. I hear something, but I don't hear you. I see you, and I can't read lips. I can see you, but I can't hear you. No, I still can't. Try muting and unmuting. See if that works. You turn your microphone on, or put it in the chat, and I'll answer it that way. I'm sorry. This is the problem with Zoom. I still can't hear you. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. All right. Anyone else? Then, Mr. Porat, is that you? You'll have to unmute, sir.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this evening and the series. Incredible. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you.
I always not struggle with, but I always think about the statement, do not forget me in old age.
Yeah. Al tazvenu be'et zikna. Right.
And I always considered that we have an opportunity every day to start again. That's the meaning it has for me. I'm curious about any comment you would make on that.
Well, there's two pieces of it. First of all, is, as you said, the idea that we have the capacity to renew ourselves. That wonderful statement from the Gerer Rebbe, where he says that the power of renewal is inside of each of us. The Gerer has this wonderful name for God. He calls God Hamichadesh, the power of renewal, so that nothing is ever stale and finished. We have the power. God has given us, and gives the world a power of constant renewal, and we can start again. We can do it again. We can try again. We can begin again, and we can renew things with new energies. That, I think, is a remarkable possibility. In my line of work, I spend a lot of time with older people. Sometimes it's a liability because I fall in love with them, and they're not around a long time, and that leaves me with a lot of tears. But I fall in love with older people, and I've been so impressed. Many of us, all of us have physical ailments as we get older. But what so impresses me are those who get older but never get old. Those who still have plans, still have visions, still have ideals, still have projects. Again, Rabbi Schulweis, my teacher, was one of these people, and he died with projects. I mean, the guy had so many things that excited him on a daily basis. There's a wonderful statement that we rabbis repeat in sermons all the time. It's about a guy who died when he was 30, but we didn't bury him till he was 90. There are people who give up at age 30. They become old and boring at age 30. And I've met people like this too. Nothing excites them, nothing interests them, and they have nothing that they care to do in the world that has any real meaning to it and any real weight to it. And they're just people that give up on life at the age of 30 or 40. And then I know people who are 80 and 90 and are young, are still filled with fire. And that capacity, I think, is so remarkable. And I think it all has to do with choosing a way of life which renews you, because you're choosing things to do which are bigger than yourself. Which are bigger than yourself. Choosing projects which are bigger than yourself. Because as you're reaching toward those projects, right, you'll overcome all the obstacles, and all the physical ailments drop away. Because this is what's important. This is what's important. And living a life that matters gives you that capacity. That's why this stuff really matters to me. So I'm trying very hard to get old, right? To get older, but not to get old. To get older, but not to get old. Right? There's a beautiful statement at the end of the book in the 92nd Psalm. It's the end of the Psalm. We say Erev Shabbat. It says, Tzadika Tamar Yifrach Ke'erez Baldoni, that the tzaddik grows mighty like a tree and is always filled with fruit. And at the end of days is able to say, life has been good to me. And that is the greatest gift of all, to be able to look back at life with all of its difficulties and all of its pain and all of its obstacles and still say, it's been a wonderful, wonderful journey because I did stuff that matters. And that's really where we are. So let me wish all of you a very, very pleasant Shabbat, a really good rest of the week, and hope to see you at all the other things that we do together. And God willing, we'll see each other in person someday soon. So here's a hug from me to all of you. Take good care. Go get a dish of ice cream and stay well.
Thank you.